Let's try this again. Hi, everybody. It's great to have so many of you with us here from all over the world for our 2020 Stay Homecoming. While of course I'd rather be in person with you, our being virtual has made events like this one more accessible to many of our alumni and friends around the world, especially those who are too far away or too busy to make it to Ithaca for a normal homecoming. Firmly in the category of extraordinarily busy people, our director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, Dr. Anthony Fauci, Weill Cornell Medicine class of 1966, and NBC anchor Kate Snow, Cornell class of 1991. We are all just delighted to have both of them with us this morning. The public health crisis that we all have been living with for the past half year has really brought to light the vital importance of expertise. It's shown us how much we all need and rely on scientific experts like Dr. Fauci, but also how much we depend on knowledge and expertise across a broad range of areas, not just public health and immunology, but also supply chain management, labor policy, communication, and educational innovation. And it has reinforced the importance of the arts and the humanities that have helped us understand and coped with the so strange times in which we're living. In reopening our campus this fall, we at Cornell made the decision to listen to those experts and to follow the science. And we also made the commitment to stay true to our mission of knowledge with a public purpose and to learn as much as we could from this pandemic. So far, even though we're clear-eyed about how easily things could change, so far that approach has brought us significant success. Today is a chance for all of us to learn from Dr. Fauci's expertise and to hear from three of the new generation of Cornellians: Rachel Friedlander, a student at Weill Cornell Medicine; Umu Berry, a student in the College of Human Ecology here in Ithaca; and Urima Sharma, a student at Cornell Tech in New York City. Thank you all for being with us today. And now I'd like to turn things over to Kate Snow. Kate?
Thank you so much, Madam President. Great to see you. Dr. Fauci, nice to see you as well. Welcome. How's 2020 going for you?
Yeah, right.
I have so many questions for you right now in this moment. The president has coronavirus. Are you a member of his medical team?
No, I'm not. His medical team is led by Dr. Sean Conley, who's the White House physician in association with the staff of the Walter Reed Hospital.
Has the White House been consulting you at all in your role on the White House Coronavirus Task Force about the messaging, about the messages that the president has put out, the statements, the videos, last night's arrival at the White House?
No, it would be unusual, Kate, for the White House to consult anybody on messaging. They have a very, very large communications team in the White House that works with the president. But as you know, the president very often is his own communication team. So I think it would be really unusual for them to ask me a question about communicating. Right. They may ask me which they do often, a scientific or medical question, but certainly not a communications question.
Have they been asking you scientific or medical questions since the president was diagnosed with coronavirus?
You know, I'm a member of the task force, so medical, I mean, it isn't anything that's personally connected with the president's care, but things like explaining a little bit about remdesivir and monoclonal antibodies, dexamethasone in advance, like what is the data showing that it works or not. Those kinds of things are frequently discussed,
so
but not in connection specifically with the president's care.
The president last night, as everyone saw, removed his mask when he got back to the White House. He posed for photos. Then he shot a video in which he said, quote, "Don't let it dominate you. Don't be afraid. Don't let it take over your lives." As a public health issue, with all your years of experience, is that the right message?
Yeah, so let me create some ground rules here, Kate. I have a job to do, and my personally contradicting the president of the United States publicly is not a good thing if I want to get my job done. But I can somehow answer your question by saying the following, by repeating what I say all the time, that it is important in the environment we're in right now with COVID-19 and the spread of infection in our community with 40,000 new infections a day, that there are some things that should be universally practiced. And that is the universal wearing of masks, avoiding crowds, keeping a distance, doing things outdoors more than indoors, and washing your hands frequently. That doesn't matter who you are. That's what you should be doing.
And I appreciate the sensitivity of your position. You've said in public before that you never want to contradict the president, but there's some mixed messaging going on. I think Americans might be a bit confused.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, let me say, for those who have faith in what I say, and I think there are a lot of people who do, that COVID-19 is a serious situation. It is a viral disease that has a broad range of manifestations with the potential to make people very ill and kill them. The numbers speak for themselves. We have 210,000 deaths and over 7 million infections in the United States and over 1 million deaths globally. So this is not a trivial disease. People in the United States should realize that it is not a trivial disease. The confusion, Kate, is that there's such a broad range of manifestations. About 40 to 45% of people who get infected have no symptoms, asymptomatic individuals. Of those who get symptoms, most of them are mild. About 80% of them are mild to moderate. That is more like a flu or a moderate flu where you don't need medical intervention. But about 15% to 20% of the people get severe or even critical disease. And it's very, very disproportionate among the elderly and among those who have underlying conditions that are well characterized now: diabetes, obesity, hypertension, heart disease, chronic lung disease. One of the problems with the confusion about how much one should be concerned about it is that everyone should be concerned about it, because even if you are a healthy person with no underlying condition and you get infected and you are without symptoms, you should not consider yourself in a safe vacuum where what happens to you doesn't impact others. Because even if you don't get a symptom, it is very likely that you will pass the infection on to someone else, who will pass it on to someone else, who will then pass it on to someone who is vulnerable. That could be somebody's father, grandfather, wife who's on chemotherapy for cancer, immunodeficient child. So everybody needs to take this outbreak very seriously.
The president this morning said he compared COVID to the flu. He said it's similar. You just said it's not always similar to the flu. So can you clarify that once again for us? Is COVID similar to the flu, as the president says?
The presenting symptoms and signs of COVID, and I have a slide that just shows that when I talk all the time, are very, very similar to what we refer to medically, Rachel will appreciate this, as a flu-like syndrome: fever, aches, fatigue, et cetera, et cetera. However, the potential for what COVID can do, what SARS coronavirus 2 can do, is very, very much different from influenza. You don't get a pandemic that kills 1 million people, and it isn't even over yet with influenza. So it is not correct to say it's the same as flu. It has some overlapping symptomatology early on, but flu doesn't do the things to you that COVID-19 can.
Just one more about the president, because it's what everyone's talking about right now. He had a combination of treatments, as you know, including an antibody cocktail that most Americans, frankly, would not have access to, right? That was an experimental treatment. Are we at the point now, the message we seem to be getting from the president is that we're at a better place now, and we have these wonderful treatments, and people will be able to survive this disease more readily? Is that the case? Are we at a point where we can treat COVID and people will survive at much higher rates?
What we have right now are interventions, some of which have been proven in randomized placebo-controlled trials. I'll get to that in a sec. And others that are still in the process of being in trial to prove whether they're safe and effective. So the president got remdesivir, which is a direct antiviral shown in a clinical trial, randomized placebo-controlled trial, in people in the hospital requiring oxygen that's low flow oxygen, not advanced disease that can actually diminish the time for recovery. Dexamethasone, which is a commonly used glucocorticoid, again was shown, steroid, was shown in a randomized placebo-controlled trial of over 6,000 people in the UK. When you have someone with advanced disease requiring ventilation and or high flow oxygen, that it significantly diminishes the 28-day mortality. So both of those drugs are available to anybody now, which were not necessarily widely used early on. So we are doing better in our ability to treat people with advanced disease. Monoclonal antibodies are now in multiple clinical trials. Monoclonal antibodies are much more against the virus itself. So you would think that early on would be the time that you would want to attack the virus, whereas later on you'd want to attack the aberrant inflammatory and immunological response.
Right. And that's the antibody treatment is what the president got in an infusion, right?
Right. It's
early
a monoclonal antibody.
But that's the one that's not widely available to all of us.
It is not widely available, but it is available on what's called compassionate usage, so that if someone gets infected, they can apply to the company. In this case, the company is Regeneron. Lilly, another big pharmaceutical company, also has a number of trials going with monoclonal antibodies. So someone like me or you, if we got infected and we could apply to the company for a compassionate usage.
So let me ask you about the vaccine, because that's also big in the news today. The FDA is proposing stricter guidelines for approval of a COVID vaccine. Do you support that new FDA guidance?
Oh, I definitely support the FDA. Those guidances were put together by career scientists and regulators at the FDA. And if you dig deep into them, there's good reasons for why they do that. So we at NIH and CDC have always been very supportive of our sister agency, the FDA.
And part of that is saying that in a vaccine trial, participants should be monitored or watched for about 2 months, right, after their last dose.
Right.
And you would agree with?
Yeah, well, the way it reads is that in a clinical trial, the median of the people in the trial, so if you have a 30,000 person trial, 15,000 people should have reached the point where they are 2 months from the last dose that they got. So if you were in a 2-dose trial, it would be after your boost. If you're in a 1-dose trial like Janssen, it would be after the single dose. And the reason for that, as articulated by the scientists at the FDA, is that there are different types of safety issues that you need to worry about. And one of them is that there's some types of adverse events occur somewhere between 40 and 60 days or 30 to 42 days. So the bracket there between 30 and 60 days are felt by the CDC to be the time when you could capture most of the adverse events that you're talking about. And the reason they say that is that you want to have not only an effective vaccine, but when you ultimately plan to give the vaccine to hundreds of millions of people who are well, you want to make sure that it's safe as well as effective.
There's reporting today that the White House is blocking those new stricter standards from the FDA. Does that then undercut the government's ability to say we've got a safe vaccine that everyone will be able to trust?
Well, I want to, I'll discuss that, Kate, when the final word as to what they're going to do, because there's a report here and a press thing there. Why don't we see what happens? And then I'll talk to you about whether I think it's a reasonable
Well, the
issue.
New York Times and the Associated Press are both reporting today that there's been this resistance from the White House.
Yeah, I think we better be careful. The one thing I've learned in my many years of Washington is that I'm a great fan of the press, but they don't They don't always get it right.
But to my other part of that question, are you worried? Let me ask it this way. Are you concerned that with talk about what the rules should be around vaccine trials, that Americans start to feel like it is politicized and start to think, I'm not going to take this thing when it comes out?
Well, obviously, we've got to be careful when there's mixed messages and inconsistencies in messaging. That's the reason why and I'm only one person, I try to the best of my ability, and I think I've been successful in being very consistent in my messaging based on facts and scientific data. But you're right, when there are mixed messages coming out of any institution, including the federal government, there is confusion as to what people should do.
So given everything you just said, what's your best guess on when we will have a vaccine in this country?
Okay. So right now we have 5 candidates that are in the United States that are in what's called phase 3 advanced trials involving tens of thousands of people. Let me give you an example of 2 of them. That doesn't mean they're the best or they're the ones that are going to, be used, but 2 of them, one made by Moderna and one made by Pfizer, started phase 3 trial on July 27th. So if you look at the number of infections that are now ongoing in the United States, the number of sites that are conducting these 60,000 and 44,000, 30,000 and 44,000 person clinical trials, and the Janssen trial is a 60,000 person trial, that one can project by modeling about when you would reach the predetermined endpoints of a study that would give you an idea whether it's safe and effective. And my projection is that it is very likely that we will know by November or December of 2020 that we have a safe and effective vaccine. It is conceivable that we will know earlier, like in October. I think that is unlikely, but not impossible. My bet would be that it's November or December. So the question is, you never know if you have a safe and effective vaccine unless you finish and do the clinical trial. But from the data that I've seen from animal studies and from phase 1 studies that have looked at individuals who received the vaccine, that the response they get is a robust neutralizing antibody response that's comparable to what you get with natural infection. So therefore, I feel cautiously optimistic, Kate, that we will have a safe and effective vaccine that will be able to be distributed by the end of this year, by the beginning of next year.
Back in the spring, the CDC warned that the fall and the winter were going to be probably one of the most difficult times we've experienced in American public health. We've got states right now seeing increases, as you know. What do you think? Or what does the fall and winter look like?
Well, as I have been saying consistently and incessantly is the other word, that the baseline of infections that we have in the United States are about 40 to 45,000 new infections each day. The United States is a big country. It's heterogeneous in many ways, including the level of infection in one section versus another. So we tend to code it like there's dark green, which is really good, namely the test positivity is very low. Then there's green, which is also quite good. Then you get into yellow, orange, and red. So if you look at the map of the United States, there are some parts of the country that are doing very well, very low test positivity. But there are others in which the test positivity, which is a pretty good predictor of what's going to happen next, is giving that warning kind of ominous indication that we're starting to see upticks in different parts of the country. In the Midwest and the Northwest, even now New York, particularly right around above New York City, kind of close to where you are, since I know New York City very well, is getting an uptick of infections that are troublesome. So having said that as a background, Kate, I'm concerned that when you go into a season in which there'll be much more indoor activity than outdoor activity, which makes it more difficult to control a respiratory-borne infection, that we should have, but we didn't, and I hope we take it much more seriously now, get that baseline level of infections way down below 40,000 a day, down below 10,000, because if we go into the fall and the winter with some sections of the country already showing an uptick of cases, we could have a tough time this fall and this winter. But it is within our grasp to turn that around. It's not rocket scientist. If you do the things I mentioned, the simple things of mask wearing, social distancing, avoiding crowds, if you do that, you do not necessarily have to have any uptick as we go into the fall and the winter. But if we don't, we will have it.
I have to get to the students. Can I ask one more quick one first? Cornell, Ithaca is doing pretty well right now. Do you think it's likely that Cornell University will have to shut down, or what's your assessment?
No, I mean, there's no necessity of anybody having to shut down unless you don't have a good plan of how to handle if students. I don't know what Cornell's plan had been. Some universities that I've spoken to, they test all the students before they get in, and then they do intermittent surveillance, and they have a capability that if a student or students get infected, they can isolate them either on the floor of a dorm or even a whole dorm.
Cornell's isolating in the Statler Hotel, which is right on campus, and they are doing all kinds of testing.
So I don't think you then have to shut down.
Let me go to the students. We've got 3 students with us, one from the Ithaca campus, one from Weill Cornell, and one from Cornell Tech. And I'm going to turn it over to Rachel first from Weill Cornell.
Hi, Dr. Fauci. It is an honor to be here with you today virtually. My name is Rachel Friedlander. I am a 4th-year medical student at Weill Cornell Medicine. I am applying into OBGYN as we speak. And my question for you today is, as the leading most viewed physician in the country on several topics throughout your career, what strategies or advice regarding communication style would you give to physician scientists who have an important message for the public?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question, Rachel. Good luck on getting your residency. I know the feeling. There are a couple of really simple things that I have abided by throughout my career in trying to communicate scientific and medical things. First of all, realize and be humble enough that you don't know everything, and do not be afraid to say you do not know. Guessing is really bad. If someone asks your opinion and you have the data, you say, based on data, this is what we think should be done. If you don't have the data and they ask your opinion, you should qualify it and say, we don't have the solid data, but based on the experience we've had thus far, this is what I think we should do. The other thing that I think is critically important, and maybe the most important thing about communication, is that one, you got to know what your audience is and decide what your message is. If you have a really good bit of information and you're talking to the wrong audience, you're a failure. If you got the right audience, but your message is garbled, you're a failure. So you got to know your audience and have a precise message. And the final thing is, the one thing you want to do when you're communicating, the goal in communicating is not to show everybody how smart you are. The goal in communicating is to have people understand what you're talking about. Because if you come across as being really smart, but no one has a clue of what you're saying, then you have failed.
Absolutely. Thank you again so much for all that you do for the country, and it's an honor to be part of your alma mater.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Umuberry. I'm a junior in human ecology. I'm majoring in healthcare policy. And this semester, I'm off campus in Ithaca. And my question was, in your career, has there ever been a moment where you doubted your leadership abilities? And if so, how did you combat that?
I don't want to seem presumptuous, but I've never doubted my leadership abilities, but there were times when leadership is questioned by people. So it's a subtle difference of answer, Uma, to your question. I never doubted that I have leadership capabilities. I've just honed them over the years. But sometimes when you're trying to make a point that's a contentious point, there are people who question. Well, I'll give you a typical example of that. Back in the early days of HIV/AIDS, when I made the decision as the leader of this, which I still am, of the institute that's doing most of the research and funding in HIV, I realized early on that we needed to incorporate the activists into our planning and thinking. We needed to listen to them. You know, the old ACT UP group from New York, we needed to listen because what they were saying really made sense about the rigidity of the scientific process and the rigidity of the regulatory process in a disease that we had no other experience with. So I decided that we were going to open up our discussions to the activist community. My own staff then began to question whether that was the right thing. They thought it would contaminate the science. As it turned out, it absolutely enriched the science by getting opinions of the community into your deliberations. So I never doubted my leadership, but some people didn't agree with me. After a while, minus the ones I got rid of, they all agreed. Just kidding.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Dr. Fauci. Again, thank you so much for being here today. My name is Anurima Sharma, and I am a second-year student at Cornell Tech in New York City. I'm getting my master's in information systems with a concentration in health technology. My question for you is, what are the biggest gaps in health and medical research that someone in the technology field may not be aware of, but may be able to help bridge?
Well, you know, that's a good question. I think there are multiple gaps that are being filled right now. If you look at the technological advances, I mean, I can give you a real-time example of how technology in vaccine platform technology has allowed us to go from identification of a brand new pathogen, namely SARS coronavirus 2, to a phase 3 trial purely on the basis of the ability to do things we never could have thought of, namely sequencing something overnight instead of taking about a year to do, and then taking the gene from the sequence and sticking it into a brand new platform like an mRNA platform or a vector platform and getting into a clinical trial within 2 months instead of 3 years. So some of the gaps we have right now, and there's broad gaps, but the gaps that we're dealing with right now is that I would like to see the tech component of our effort get us a diagnostic that is 15 cents in cost that you can give to everybody in the country to test every single day to see if they're positive. And if you're positive, stay home or get medical care. And if you're not, you should feel safe to go to work. But something that is highly sensitive and highly specific with essentially no false negatives, namely a sensitivity that's close to 100%. So if you can do that for me, give me a call after we get off this discussion, because that's what we need.
I'll try my best. Thank you so much for being here today.
You're welcome.
I'll come back in, Dr. Fauci, with a couple more. So for the Cornell audience, what can Cornell University do? We're such a robust organization, so much research and teaching is happening. What could the role of Cornell be to help mitigate the next, hopefully there won't be one, but another pandemic?
Well, Kate, I think when you ask that question, I can think of sort of two buckets. One is, the obvious academic excellence and scientific capability of so many of the Cornell schools, including the school that I went to and really was the foundation of my medical career, not only at Cornell, but at the New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center, where I did all my internship residency and chief residency and everything else in my early training. So there's the scientific contribution. But one of the things that I think could be helpful, if you get an institution of young people who are the students and even some of the younger faculty, who by example can essentially show what you asked me in your question early on, is the kind of behavior and taking this outbreak really very seriously. Because just as I mentioned, in many of the arenas where there are young people, they understandably, and I would say to give them some credit, even innocently, don't realize that if they don't abide by the public health measures that would prevent infection in anybody and everybody, then they are propagating the outbreak. So if the Cornell, and I'll just take the Ithaca campus, if Cornell could really have such a low rate of infection among the students.
So the rate right now for positivity is 0.04%.
Right. So then you're doing it. You're showing that it can be done with a group of students who have the same interest and desire to have fun at the same time that you're getting your education, of doing the kind of things you like to do in college. But if you can show that you can maintain that test positivity that low, Cornell is a highly respected institution in the academic circles, not only domestically, but internationally. If you could show that you can do it, it would be a great example of what can be accomplished.
How did you get from Cornell, from Weill Cornell and everything you quickly ran over all the things you did at Cornell to where you are now?
How did that happen?
Is that a long story? Give me the short version.
I'm sorry, Kate. Well, it's taking advantage of opportunities that come your way that you have no power over at all. I mean, when I talk to students or when I give addresses to mostly young people, I say that first of all, you got to have good background and good training. And I do, I'm a Cornell person, so I have good training. But then what you've got to do is realize that the directions that you take in your life, even though planning is good, very often the things that take you into areas and directions that you never planned, you have no control over. When I came down to the NIH, I was doing things with, I always wanted to go back to Cornell and practice medicine on York Avenue and 69th Street. When I got to the NIH, I got bitten by the science bug. So I wanted to do science. And I did that for multiple years. So I had an opportunity. I didn't think that would happen to me. But then in 1981, all of a sudden, something happened to the world that I had no control over that changed my life. And that was the recognition of the first cases of what would ultimately be called AIDS, first from Los Angeles, then from New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. And I made a decision to completely change the direction of my research and focus on this, at the time, interesting group of young gay men who had this strange disease that we didn't have a name and we didn't have an etiology. I took that call. People ask me, why did you do that? There was something about the mystery of that disease that attracted me, and I threw all of my effort into it. And then all of a sudden, everything else happened after that.
You work a lot right now. You were telling me you don't get a lot of sleep.
No.
What keeps you up at night?
What used to keep me up at night is what I'm doing now. It's an interesting question, Kate. I get asked years ago,
right,
multiple times, what is your worst nightmare? What keeps you up at night? Well, I always say, that would be a brand new disease that jumps species from an animal to a human reservoir, that's respiratory spread, that has two conflating characteristics. One, it's spectacularly efficient in its spread from human to human. And two, it has the capability of a high degree of morbidity and mortality, either in the general population or among a subset of group. And sure enough, here we are in 2020, and we have my perfect nightmare, namely a pandemic that has already killed 1 million people worldwide and is still raging throughout the world. So what keeps me up at night is acting out the things that kept me up at night theoretically is now keeping me up at night practically.
Is there anything specifically now, though, that really has you the most? And we've talked about a lot of things in the past hour.
Yeah.
Is there one thing that really makes you so nervous?
Yeah, well, it isn't nervous. It's the urgency of getting an intervention, both a vaccine and some of the therapies that you and I just discussed a little while ago, to get them ready. Because, as a physician and a physician scientist, I am very cognizant of people getting sick and people dying. That's real stuff for me. That's not a statistic. Because when you do it every day, it's not a statistic. So it doesn't worry me. It just gives me more energy to say, we've got to get a vaccine, we've got to get drugs, and we've got to get people to listen to us when we say what the public health measures are that we need to follow. Excuse me.
It's okay. Do you think people are getting fatigue,
Yes.
getting complacent? Because I see it even in my town, people who are well-educated and know what they should be doing, they're fudging the rules a little bit now. We're sick of wearing masks. We're sick of, keeping apart and staying outside all the time.
Yeah, that's an understandable reaction to being essentially pulled out of a normal world for now close to 9 months, 8 months of doing that. I think if we can convince people that the easiest way to get out of this mess is to continue to do the things that we're doing, because if we don't, we're going to stay in this mess. So it's sort of like a strange message. I know you don't like to wear a mask. I know you don't like to be without friends and congregate. We know you like to be close to people and give them a hug. We know you like to do all those things. You don't like to do all those things. But if you don't do them, you're going to be in this situation longer and longer. We can put an end to this if we do it. And that's the message I always end my discussions with, and saying, there is an end to this. This will end. We're not going to be like this indefinitely. And we will get there more quickly if we do the things that you and I have been talking about the public health measured, superimposed upon, and synergizing with a vaccine and better treatments.
What do the holidays look like? Halloween is on a Saturday. You got Thanksgiving coming. You got Christmas coming. For the students watching, for the alums watching, what do the holidays look like?
It's going to be like no holidays you've had before. I think you understand that if you're in an area where there's a lot of infection around, you're not going to have the typical kind of holidays. So you've got to make plans, certainly around Thanksgiving, and you're going to modify the situation with Halloween, obviously. But you want to make sure that you do things more likely with a smaller group of people, likely with people who might be able to get tested before, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be wearing a mask and shouldn't be keeping distances. You've just got to be careful. It's tough. It's not easy. It's tough.
And for those of us who are parents, what should kids be keeping in mind as they go back into classrooms?
Yeah. Well, you don't want to scare children, but you want to be realistic and honest with them and tell them that the kinds of things they may need to do that's different from a normal class day. You may need to wear a mask depending upon what school you're in. You may have an altered schedule. You may have to do part things virtually and part things in person. It very well may not be like you have seen in the past and like you're looking forward to. But it just is what it is. We can't run away from reality.
Let's end on a hopeful note, if we can. I asked you what keeps you up at night, but what gives you great hope? What in this moment in October of 2020 makes you go, yeah?
Well, what gives me great hope, I think, is my confidence in the scientific process, and that we will get interventions. and they're not so far away, we will get interventions that will get us back towards normality. And then when we combine those interventions with a modest amount of public health measures, we will ultimately return to normal.
It's a good way to end. It's about time. I think my time is about up. So Dr. Anthony Fauci, there's so many more questions I could ask you. Thank you so much for being with us today. I know everyone in the Cornell community really appreciates how busy you are, and that you would take time to speak to this audience means a lot.
Thank you. Good to be with you. Thank you for having me.